Good evening and welcome. My name is Jacqueline Barber and I direct the University Committee on Human Rights Studies, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening. Let me say a few words first about the University Committee on Human Rights Studies, and then I will just say another few words about the series of which this event is the first before I hand you over to our moderator. The University Committee, as many of you know, is a body that brings together the many different human rights programs, centers, and institutions at Harvard. And the idea is to create a university-wide debate about human rights topics. So as many of you know, what we do is we support research, we support internships and fellowships for students who are interested in human rights, and give students a chance to intersect with parts of the university apart from their own school where human rights scholarship and debate is taking place. And we hope you'll take advantage of that during your time at Harvard. This event is one of three events which we've entitled Human Rights Debates at Harvard. And the idea is really to open up debate on topics on which reasonable people can disagree. It's sometimes said, I think, of people who work in the human rights field that we tend to preach to the converted, that we tend to talk within our own group and not to really address big issues where there is disagreement. And of course, that's a critically important thing for us to do. And the idea behind this series is precisely to bring to an audience people who are extremely well qualified to talk about contentious issues of great public moment. And so let me just say 2 seconds worth of words about the other events in the series, and I hope many of you will have seen posters which look like this, which advertise the other events. The second event will take place on March the 15th, and the title of that event is What Sort of a Right is Marriage? Should it be a legal right? Is it an ethical entitlement? And we have a very diverse panel of speakers with radically different views on the topic. And then our third event is called Life, Death, and Property Rights. Should life-saving drugs be free? And again, this event will deal with a tension between different rights, if you like, the right to life or the right to health versus property rights or intellectual property rights. So I think that also will be an interesting debate. Today's debate addresses one of the critical and central political, social, and economic challenges of our time, the fight against poverty. And you will hear a debate about the relevance of rights talk or human rights to that central issue. For those of you who are particularly interested in this topic, there is an ongoing series at the School of Public Health directed by the François-Xavier Bagnoud Center for Health and Human Rights on poverty and human rights issues. And so I encourage those of you who are interested to follow up by looking at what that center has to offer. As I say, the panelists we have this afternoon could not be better qualified to deal with the issue. I am, and we are, honored and delighted to have Professor Sen and Professor Frankel, who are going to discuss the topic, and also delighted to have as our moderator Professor David Ellwood, who is the Scott M. Black Professor of Political Economy and, of course, the Dean of the Kennedy School. He is a renowned labor economist who specialized in issues of poverty and welfare, low pay and unemployment, and has a very distinguished career both in public service, having served in the Clinton administration on issues to do with welfare reform, and of course a very eminent scholarly credentials, having many publications to his name. So I don't think we could have a better moderator for this forum. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, here we are. Friday afternoon, nobody's going to be in the forum. Why would you come? This is terrific. This is, to me, in many ways, Harvard and the Kennedy School at its best. The kinds of issues that come together here are things that I think are at the very heart of why we're here and why we should be here. Issues of, and by the way, all issues very close to my heart. Human rights, poverty, economics, as well as thinking about the ways in which our desires to tackle these issues interact and how the best way to think about them both strategically and intellectually and every other way. So it's an extraordinary moment, and I'm just very, very pleased to have the opportunity to be here. We're going to focus tonight. We'll see where we focus tonight. I think tonight arises in part because of some intemperate remarks of one of our panelists, Jeff Frankel, to Jacqueline, talking about when and where the language of human rights is helpful or not so helpful in talking about tackling poverty or issues of economics. And so here we are to talk about these kinds of things. We are, of course, joined by one of the premier minds of our time, Amartya Sen, who's been very, very eloquent in talking about and bridging the gap between thinking about issues of economics, issues of inalienable rights, issues of inclusion, and the like. I will not go on in great detail about either man, in part because you're here to hear them. But let me just say a couple of things about each. Dr. Sen was born in 1933 in Bengal, India, and he's an economist by training, and he studied at Presidency College in Calcutta and earned his PhD at Trinity College in the other Cambridge. He's taught at a number of universities in India and England and Delhi, London School of Economics, Oxford. He's been a visiting professor at MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, and Cornell. But of course, we're fortunate to have him right here now, where he's the Lamont Professor in Economics Department at Harvard, among other things. And of course, in 1988, Professor Sen was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics on his work on fundamental problems in welfare economics and social choice. Of course, he's got something like 20 honorary degrees, and he's been the head of every major economic association in various ways. It's a remarkable treat to have Dr. Sen here. Also here is Jeff Frankel. He's the James Harpel Professor of Capital Formation here at the Kennedy School and Growth here at the Kennedy School. He was born in San Francisco in 1953 and graduated from Swarthmore. In 1974, received his PhD in economics from MIT. He has been a professor at Berkeley as well as here at Harvard. He's held positions at the Federal Reserve Bank, the Institute for International Economics. He was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, where his responsibilities included international economics, macroeconomics, and the environment. He also serves on the Business Cycle Dating Committee, which officially declared 2001 a recession, and after that you could all relax or feel bad or something. His primary focus of research is international finance, monetary policy, regional blocks, international environmental issues. The plan is this. I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn to present some opening ideas, arguments, if you will, and I'll start with Professor Frankel, then turn to Professor Sen, and then I'll ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up to the audience before closing. So let me start with Professor Jeffrey Frankel.
Well, thank you, Dean Elwood. Thank you to the Center for Human Rights for sponsoring this, bringing us together for this, and thank all of you for coming out on a cold Friday night. From the introductions, you might think there was some kind of parody that you have two experts here on the subject, but the fact is I am at a tremendous disadvantage vis-a-vis Professor Sen on this subject. And it's not just that I don't have a Nobel Prize and he doesn't. The subject of human rights is an area where I have not contributed at all to the professional literature. It's worse than that. I haven't read the professional literature. Well, I've read a little bit of it. I've read just a little bit, and that includes Professor Sen's writings. But I just want to begin, even though disclaimers are rather boring, I have to say there are lots of people who are more qualified to talk about this subject than I am. Although they tend not to be economists, and that's the point. As David mentioned, the origins of this event were a comment that I made to Jackie Baba that most economists think that the language of rights is not useful for talking about economic goals, such as reduction of poverty or standard of living or income, any of that. And I guess she found that surprising, and she did say right away, well, what about Amartya Sen? And I said, yes, That's one. But I think it's true, and we're not going to spend time debating that most economists do not think that rights language is useful for this subject. I'm not going to speak for all economists. I'm going to tell you why I think that. And I've got just a few slides here. So this is the question. Should rights language apply to economic goals such as poverty reduction? And one more qualifier or disclaimer. I think human rights is a tremendously important concept. I don't think it's controversial applying it to torture, for example, freedom from torture, or lots of other issues. And just for the record, I belonged to Amnesty International for 20 years, so I do think it's important. We're just talking about the question of whether it is appropriate or useful to apply rights language to economic goals. There are 4 ways. I'm not talking about the academic literature. 4 distinct ways that I think I hear people use the word rights. The first one is, I know that such and such a group or such and such a species has the right to some resource because God told me, and that's just it, and there's no discussion. And by assumption, if there's no discussion, there's no discussion, and we can't talk about it here. So I'm going to go past that one pretty quickly. Then there's the second one, which I think is, in my view, seems to be the right one, which is that there has been an agreement among either internationally or among some subset of people that people have a right. And in this case, if someone subsequently believes that they've been denied that right, they can point to something, ideally that's been written down, although that's not necessary, and appeal to some larger body. Now, Professor Sen makes a point that it doesn't have to be a legal right, doesn't have to be written down, it doesn't have to be in law, and I agree with that completely. But in my view, there should be some sort of institution, some sort of common recognition that this right has been agreed to. And just to name examples of other cases where it's not the law, and yet there is some understood set of rules. I mean, here's some examples I've thought of. Rules that govern the relationship between a reporter and a confidential source, between an arresting police officer and a civilly disobedient demonstrator, between a priest and a parishioner, between a doctor and a patient, and so on. The patient, we say, has the right to expect confidentiality, even if it's not enshrined in the law, and there's some mode of appeal somewhere he can appeal to if he feels that's been violated, and similarly for the others. Now, the third one, this one shouldn't be quite as controversial, is that I think it's useful to make a distinction between a right that has been agreed. Oops, I'm sorry. I screwed it up already. I propose that there be an agreement that people have a particular right. This is a distinct usage. Maybe that's what they call aspirational rights. If you say, I think women have the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, or I think Americans have the right to health care, you don't mean that this has been agreed upon already. You mean, I am proposing it. I think that this should happen. And Professor Sen writes, quote, the ethical significance of rights provide good grounds for seeking realization through institutional expansion and reform. So that's fine. And I don't want to be doctrinaire. I don't insist that you always put the word proposed in. If you're carrying a sign, to say, I hereby propose such and such a right, doesn't fit on a picket sign. So I'm not going to be too insistent on that, but that is an important distinction between what has been agreed and what should be. There are some things that probably should be rights that have not yet been agreed. But also, vice versa, it seems to me there's some things that have been written down in some agreements that would not be on my list. So here's vice versa. I realize that there have been international agreements going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Eleanor Roosevelt, and probably going back a lot farther than that have mentioned economic rights on the list. I just think that that's not useful, and I'd like to take that off. Not because it's not important, which I'm going to get to in a moment, but because it seems to me it's an imprecise use of language, number one, and it's not effective, or at worst, it's counterproductive. The fourth definition or use that I think I hear people use the word rights is, I think such and such a goal is just really, really, really important. And my suspicion is that's what a lot of people mean a lot of the time when they say such and such is a right or should be a right. And I can't emphasize strongly enough that I think that eliminating poverty or reducing poverty around the world is probably the single most important, highest priority economic objective of our time. Half the world, almost 3 billion people, live below the poverty line, measured as at $2 a day on a purchasing power parity basis. And that is, I think, the most important economic problem in the world, and I think should be our top priority. I just don't think it's useful to use the language of rights to describe it. We have lots of other words like urgent or high priority or really important. And I also think it's not even useful, even as a tactic, it's not even expedient. Let me give you some examples, just a 2x2 box as to the distinction, because I very much want to emphasize the distinction between saying something is really important and saying that it's a right. And I've got one of each kind. First, something that we agree is a very important goal and where the language of rights is appropriate, freedom from torture. Now notice, I'm not so naive as to say that it has to be 100% enforceable. It seems like we're busy flouting the Geneva Convention even as we speak. So I know it's not 100% enforceable, but there is a usually recognized international agreement, and I think that that is very useful. In the upper right-hand column, I have something that I think is also an important goal, but where the language of rights just isn't appropriate or useful, and that's reducing auto accidents. It wouldn't make sense to say Americans have the right to not have auto accidents. It just doesn't make sense. It isn't a useful thing to say, and yet it's tremendously important. Let's go to the lower left column, something that is very unimportant, but where the language of rights is appropriate. In the game of Monopoly, if you pass go, you have the right to collect $200. If the other player doesn't give you $200, you can hold up the rules and you can appeal to the other players and you can say, see, I have the right. Okay. That is a correct use of the word right. It's not important, but it's a correct use of the word right. And then in the lower right-hand column, the right of every American to drive a BMW is neither important in my view, nor obviously is the language of rights useful. All right, well, what's wrong? And I'm getting near the end of my slides and my remarks. Well, what's the harm in using, even if I convinced you maybe that it's imprecise, what's the harm in using the language of rights? I think that it can be counterproductive, and there's a number of different ways or respects in which it can be counterproductive. First, it sends the wrong signals. Let's talk about the countries where there's a lot of poverty. Both the intellectuals and the public and the governments, if they are talking about the right to a certain standard of living, it gets them off on, it diverts attention from the most important steps that need to be taken to improve their national economy. And I think often you'll end up with more poverty rather than less if you use that language. I've got 3 examples here. First, in the 1970s, a lot of the third world used the language of the new international order, international economic order, I guess it was, where the rhetoric was that because of the imperialism, the West owed reparations to these countries. And I mean, they weren't going to get it anyway, but the point is, I think that it often deflected attention away from countries doing what they needed to do in terms of improved policies, macroeconomic policy and institutions, and all the kinds of things we teach about here at the Kennedy School. Second, a specific example, German unification in 1990, when East Germany joined with the West. The productivity of a typical East German worker was far below that of the West. Estimates say something like a quarter, maybe. The notion that an East German worker was entitled to the same standard of living as a West German worker became the policy. And more specifically, there were 2 things, that they decided to convert East German marks to West German marks at a rate of 1-to-1, even though the productivity was much lower. And the Chancellor Kohl set this policy of bringing East German wages rapidly up to parity with West German wages. And both of those were part of this idea that East German workers had the right to the same standard of living. Well, many economists predicted, and I think history has borne this out, that East Germany's economic progress would be slower as a result of that, because the wages got out ahead of productivity, which means that labor costs were higher, which means, except for the heavily subsidized and government investment in East Germany, real investment didn't go into East Germany. And here we are 15 years later, and East Germany is still depressed, and West Germany, the entire German economy has been slowed down or even crippled by this. They would have been much better off to say, for a while, wages are going to be lower until, and are going to rise with productivity. They would have gotten much more investment, productivity would have increased faster, and they'd be better off today in East Germany. Third example, India, I don't know if this is yet the law, but it's been tabled in Parliament. The new government in December is proposing an employment guarantee, every poor household to be entitled to 100 days of work on public works projects. Well, in each case, you can see the sentiment, but for reasons I won't go into, I think this is likely to do more harm than good. So the first reason it can be harmful is it sends the wrong signals to the other countries. I've got two more reasons why it can be harmful. It undermines the credibility of other international agreements. We've got a lot of other agreements out there, Geneva Convention, lots of them, and most of them are good and useful. If you start applying the word rights to everything, including things that can't be delivered and where it isn't really appropriate, you undermine the legitimacy of the agreements that are really important. And lastly, in terms of expediency, if the idea is, well, we want to raise visibility of this issue, we've got all these, we've got AIDS, we've got Africa, we've got all these problems, and we need to, imagine I'm Jeff Sachs and giving this very stirring, charismatic speech, getting us all worked up on the issue. We want to do something about it. Is it useful to use the language of rights to say, look, there's an agreement, an international agreement about this? Will that help mobilize support? Well, in the United States, it will not. If you say something is a UN agreement, that kills it. I mean, that is not an argument in favor. Not in the heartland, not on the coasts, not in the Republican Party, not in the Democratic Party, maybe in parts of Cambridge, but nowhere else. So political expediency, forget it. I think that's my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me turn to Professor Sen.
Thank you. It's very nice to always to hear Jeff. He has good arguments and he presents them well. That doesn't mean that you said that rights really depends on our agreement. Now, this is not going to be right, I think, because we might disagree still on the content of what he said. I think part of the difficulty begins with Jeff's defining rights as a form of language. Is it a useful language? You know, is it better to put it in Chinese or Arabic or Hindi or English? But that's not what we are discussing. We're discussing, shall we recognize certain claims, ethical claims, social claims, which might have motivational foundations for legal case, as it was in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, for example, that people have rights which the Constitution should recognize. They existed, but the Constitution had to recognize it. That was the claim. Similarly, the French Declaration of Rights of Man. The question wasn't, is it a good language? The question is, do we recognize that there is such a claim? And people like Tom Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, and others, not to mention Jefferson, and we're discussing in what sense these claims have a substance. So I don't think it's a language we're looking at. Now, Jeff gives lots of good examples of why languages could be very bad. I think I'd forgotten the monstrosity of the new international economic order. It's a kind of painful memory. It's a little like opening an old wound, because it came with a lot of flourish and achieved nothing. It's quite right. There are lots of other things. The language used in the German reunification policy may well have been wrong. But that indicates absolutely nothing about the substance of the claim that we are looking at. That is, the claims about rights, like right not to be tortured, which are among the basic human rights, or right to participate in public discussion, democratic rights, or the right not to be hungry, right to receive medical treatment if you're ill, and if the medicine can be produced and produced at affordable prices. These are issues, these are substance issues, and it's not a question of, can I put it differently? That's not what we're discussing at all, it seems to me. Now, what is the importance of recognizing the claims of rights? You see, rights, and there are three things connected with rights. One is rights a statement at something being important. That's a statement rather like welfare, like saying it's very bad for a society to have hungry people. That would be a statement about things that are good and things that are wrong or things that are bad, like people going hungry and dying of hunger. But what right does is to say that they have actually a claim. That's the first statement. So it takes a kind of statement of objectives and converts it into a claim form. And that takes you to the second thing, namely, along with rights comes duties. And as Immanuel Kant discussed in considerable detail, the duties of different kinds. The perfect obligations of the kind that Jeff immediately recognizes, that if someone promises $100 and doesn't give it to you, then you have a right against it. That's a perfect obligation. Imperfect obligation are those obligations that people generally have. Just to give an example, when, I guess 40 years ago, Kitty Genovese was murdered in was it Queens, I guess, in broad daylight, and 40 people saw it and didn't come and help. You could say three bad things happened. The primary bad thing, of course, Kitty Genovese got murdered and killed. The second bad thing is, of course, the nastiness of the murderer. And if our job was only to comment on that, that's a perfect obligation. It's a legal right, in fact, that Kitty Genovese has not to be killed by anyone. But I think what the human rights is saying is to move on to the territory also of what Kant called imperfect obligation. Namely, people have an obligation to help in a reasonable way if they could. And in this case, if 40 people could see it and did nothing to help, then there is an ethical failure of some kind. Some countries, like France, have something like a legal right connected with criminal negligence. You can sue people for not doing it. This country doesn't, Britain doesn't, India doesn't, and so on. But whether or not you have these as legal rights, these are, as Kant noted, imperfect obligations. You cannot define it, this is this guy's right to do exactly that, like this guy's right to return $100 he had borrowed. It's not like that. But to reflect on what is it that you can do. And that immediately extends the reach of such issues as people dying of illnesses without getting medical treatment, which can be produced at affordable price, or people needlessly going hungry. And then the question arises, whose obligation is it? Now you could say, well, it's obligation of the state, nothing else. And if it's not my state, then I have no obligation at all. What the human rights is doing is to point out that there is an imperfect obligation across the world. It's not a matter of language only. It is making a substantive claim. The third thing it's doing, since it is ultimately, as Kant discusses, a reason for you to consider and discuss with others and participate in public reasoning as to what should be done about it, is that it's bringing the issue into focus as a subject for public discussion. And if one regards public discussion as important, the claims of rights, as you would like to call it, the language of rights, even though I don't quite accept that diagnosis, but in that bigger sense, the language of rights, is encouraging public discussion, which is extraordinarily important. That's one of the reasons why media are banned in countries. That's one of the reasons why you write a dissenting editorial, you may end up in prison. If one is trying to defend the rights of these people to fight, you are also emphasizing the importance of public discussion and the subject matter of what is it that they are discussing. And that also makes it difficult. I mean, in terms of its claims, just to take an example, the question of people dying of illnesses without getting medical treatment, that, I think, if there's a change in that direction, if there's some action, we don't know how much there will be, there have been some action. I think even that would have been very difficult without actually bringing in the importance of these failures and the the need for people to take an interest, a general demand on people to pay attention to it. Now, I don't really want to say that in every case the discussion has promoted things, but in many cases it has, and the fact that they're effective is brought about by the terror with which the ruling governments often treat them. And the question, whenever people say, we have different values, East and West, Iranians may have a different value from ours, the question have to ask, why is it that these people get arrested if they try to express a different view? And rather than viewing them as ambassadors for Western values, you have to view them as what they are, namely Iranian dissidents. And if Iranian dissidents get locked up, that is because the people who are locking them up are afraid of those discussions. And the rights provide a very good forum, very good way of discussing it. Now, you've discussed the question of enforceability, which in a sense there's a framework, and the economic and social rights are often taken to be something which are not necessarily realized. But there it seems to me that analytically there's a real distinction between having a right which is not yet fulfilled, not yet realized, and having no right at all. There seems to be, if you were to merge these together, it seems to me you're losing an analytical distinction of some importance. To say that it cannot be realized now, therefore they don't have a right, it seems to me to be not really not clear. It seems to lack clarity, and I'm being rather polite there, I think. It's really a distinction that we do need. And as far as fulfillment is concerned, in a world after 9/11 and terrorist violence here and there, the whole idea that these rights of safety from attack, these first-generation rights, could be all realized is ridiculous. If that were the case, we won't have an enormous debate going on as to how homeland security should be secured. These are problems like providing medicine to those who are ill, or providing food to those who are hungry. These are all challenges that has to be faced, and very good way of discussing, getting on with it, is to discuss what can be done. So I think the importance of that is great. Just one final point, because I know we have only 10 minutes. How far down am I in 10 minutes left? Okay, all right. You see, I think the not recognizing the importance of something can lead to a heavy price being paid. Take a country from which I think the world has learned more than from any other, namely China. Learned historically, but learned in the present day too. And in the pre-reform period, in the pre-1979 period, the Chinese were the leaders of the world and spreading basic education and basic health care for all. 79, they reformed the economic system in a way that was badly needed and went on to produce massive economic growth. But they decided then, more or less one morning, it was announced that the state-based social insurance was abolished. In the rural areas, it came from the communes. In the urban areas, directly from the state. And what you ended up with a system where you have to buy your private insurance by paying money. China is the only country in the world in which you actually have to buy your vaccine. Now, the whole idea that healthcare is a kind of right could have been a matter that could have been raised. Now, of course, the primary issue was that it's not a democratic country in that way, certainly, and therefore it wasn't engaged. But what is remarkable is that you didn't even hear a murmur about it. In one stroke, China went from a Canada-type system to a US-type system, which in this case is not an improvement. And it produced the result, certainly, of what we have seen. China had a faster rate of growth than anywhere else, whereas in this period, the Indian life expectancy has grown about 3 times as fast as China. The gap has been halved. Parts of India, like Kerala, which combines democracy as well as right-based discussions, particularly rights of an economic, social kind, have actually now dramatically went ahead of China. If you look, infant mortality rate at the time of economic reform, China had 37 per thousand, Kerala had 37. China has now 30, Kerala has 10. How has this come about? I think the understanding that children, if they're ill, require medical attention. And if you're getting richer, you should be able to afford more and more that rather than less and less that. Makes a big difference. I think the language of right could have saved a major problem. I personally have great faith in Chinese wisdom, so I believe that these will be corrected, just as I believe the lack of democracy would be corrected too. But not to recognize that there is a real lacuna in not being able to engage in really important debates, I think is a mistake. So I would like to persuade Jeff, since you are such a reasonable person, to see what is it that we are doing. It's not that we are trying to speak in Cantonese or some other language. We're trying to assert something that's quite important, and that I think you, like all other economists too, should take seriously. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to ask Jeff to quickly respond, but my goal here is to make this as concrete as possible. And we're specifically focused on whether the language of rights and the way in which the language of rights is helpful in economic settings. So talking about the language of rights around torture or whatever. And let me, if it's appropriate, Jeff, but you may choose not to do this, let me just urge you to sort of think specifically about two particular kinds of rights that Professor Sen mentioned. The right not to be hungry and the right to medical care. Now, I don't know whether adequate medical care or whatever was used there, and that may be part of your point. But talk about those and to illustrate why, since those seem so on their face, apparently important, central, critical elements of a just society.
Okay. I'm going to assume that the subject is language of rights. I think that's the title on the forum. I mean, there's no disagreement between us if you want to start using the word that...
I agree that's the title of the forum.
But if you want to say, I mean, at some point, a few points you said, I think we should recognize that such and such is important, and I got no quarrel with that at all. So we can just sit down right now if we're talking about whether these things are important. I think it's tremendously important. I think poverty reduction is the most important economic issue of our time.
No, important in the way. I'm sorry, do you mind, Michael? Important in the way that it generates claims on others. Perfect as well as imperfect obligations. But you seem to give no role at all to what Kant called imperfect obligation, and which, I might say, a great economist, got to be so, Adam Smith, discusses fairly extensively what claims it has on other human beings. Why is it that you have to bring in impartial spectators to think about what you ought to do? These are discussions of imperfect obligation. These are not legal rights.
I want to get to David's specific examples in a moment, but let me say that first, I'm not insisting that something be in the law. I think legal rights are a subset of rights, but there are all kinds of other institutions, and I want to define the word institutions very broadly. And I gave examples of, what the code of professional ethics for doctors or journalists, or the what the little rules of civil disobedience are, that you're not supposed to fight back, and in return the policeman's not supposed to kill you. I mean, there's all kinds of useful institutions so I agree completely that we're not limited to the law. And I also agree that it is legitimate to say that something, yes, currently is not been agreed to, and even if it were agreed to, it wouldn't be 100% deliverable, but I think it's worth proposing it, I think it's worth pushing it, I think it's worth trying to get an agreement, because you're going to get some enforceability, because I think I'm an economist, because the benefits exceed the costs. To say that it doesn't matter at all whether it could ever be agreed upon or has been agreed upon, and if it were agreed upon, it doesn't matter at all whether it would be delivered or could be delivered, to my mind, makes it not useful. So we can say that we all have the right to a BMW. I mean, but I think that's not useful because it's not likely to happen, and to be agreed upon, and if it were agreed upon, it wouldn't happen. Let's do some of the specific examples. You brought up China. When I gave my examples of the new international economic order and the German unification, I actually showed a lot of forbearance. I didn't mention communism because I thought that would be a low blow. I mean, to accuse it's like accusing someone of being a communist. But that was the basis of sort of the communist system, was that people had a right to a standard of living and to consumption. And it didn't work. The poverty rate by our standards was much higher under that system than under ours. David asked about medical care and the right not to be hungry. Now, medical care, I mean, you know, in most European countries, it is written down that you have the right to medical care. So that's been an agreed upon right. In the United States, that's never exactly been written down. I think the current system we've got is pretty messy. I mean, the fact is, if you show up at the emergency room, they do actually take care of you. And so I actually, you know, I was with John Kerry that let's regularize this system. And so I wouldn't be opposed to having that be sort of a right in the U.S. But it's not philosophy doesn't tell me. It's not some God-given natural right. It's deciding, is it worth it for us all to agree as a society? And for my money, education and healthcare are sort of on the edge. I think the answer is definitely not for purely economic goods, because we've got a system, we've got the market system that delivers that, versus torture and human rights. Market system's got nothing to do with that. So that one, it clearly is worth it to write it down, or to agitate to get it written down if you're in a country where it's not written down, and then to enforce it, because it can happen. It does happen in some countries. That's worth it. To my mind, the right to be free of hunger, it sounds good, but no, I don't. I think the number of hungry people that you end up with is going to be greater in a country that writes that down.
I don't know what gives you that confidence that would be the case. I think if you want to make people less hungry, you have to build some institutions for it. To say that rights follow from institutions is right. That is, the realization of rights do follow from institutions. But demanding that certain institutions come into being, like democratic institutions, if you're fighting for democracy, get arrested because you're wanting political rights of everyone, or you want people not to be hungry and you agitate about it. Now, what is the, if you make the rights just conditional on institutions, there's no argument by which you could say we should change the institution. The institution, the Chinese had it in 78, they didn't have it in 1980. It was there, it's gone. Therefore, the no more right. It can't be that it's so conditional on that. It really turns on something on the basis of which we could say that the government made a mistake here. Why is it that famines don't occur in democratic countries? Why is it? It's mainly because that if you're in a democratic country and if people die of famines, it's regarded that the government's obligation to give people the realization of the right not to be hungry, not to die of hunger, was violated. The government failed in something. Now, that has not been, the number of hungry people haven't gone up as a result of recognizing that, exactly the same. India continued to have people dying of famines until 43, which is the last famine which I observed as a child, not against after independence. Not that India was doing anything terribly brilliant. It's just that in a multi-party democratic system, a government is enormously blamed for not carrying out its obligation for protecting people from famine deaths and preventing famine. So to recognize these claims doesn't have anything of the negative effect that you seem to think that they would have. You keep giving examples like, you know, the peculiar policy that Kohl had about equalizing wages in East and West Germany, which I criticized too. I thought that it didn't make any sense. There are all kinds of ways that we could debate about that. The particular thing about employment guarantee in India that you mentioned is the subject of a debate. My position on that was, I did speak on that it should not be a legal right, but also regarding employment to be a very important human right is a very powerful thing to do. And we would like to see what is it that the government is doing. And in a democratic country, you press for it, and the government falls for it. The lack of it's the inability to protect the Muslim minorities in Gujarat when there were riots that tarnished the BJP government very badly, and the inability for the economic growth to be shared by the poor, who too have a right to get jobs, get some kind of income, not to be so hungry. Between these two, these were the two general factors, along with various local factors, which led to the demise of the government and the replacement of a government which is more committed to doing this. So it seems to me that to deny that these recognition, these public discussions are helpful, seem to me to hit at the very root of what makes democracy such a powerful political organizational system.
Well, of course, I am in favor of democracy, and of course, I'm in favor of public discussion of important priorities. We have lots of really useful words like this is important, I think we should put a priority in a national budget, nothing's more important than this is urgent. There's lots and lots of words you can use in democracy, in public discussion. It's just the use of the word rights that I question. I assume that in Albania and plenty of, we're not debating democracy here, in plenty of non-democratic countries, the word, the
I'm
right
very seized of the fact, you know what, my puzzle is this, Jeff. I'm very seized of the fact that you're objecting to the use of the right and you know, you're taking it as a language. It's not still clear to me what is it that you're finding wrong. You keep saying, if you have these rights, my God, the world would be dreadful. Why?
No, if you look, if it's a question of what language philosophers use, I'm not in philosophy.
Forget the philosophers. I'm not only speaking as an economist, but I'm just speaking as a human being. You and I chat, we can follow each other. We happen to have a language in common. It may not be the language of right, but at least we follow English.
Right. You at the end said a country that has somehow embodied a right not to be hungry may end up being more hungry than a country that does not. That seems to me to go at the heart of some of this. One question is whether it is a deep, fundamental moral right, but I also hear you saying something that's operational and strategic and functional. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that particular notion to help me clarify what you're saying?
Well, I'm certainly not saying it's an iron law that any time you use the language of rights for economic goals, automatically, necessarily, you'll get less of that economic goal. But I would say that on average, that is the tendency. The idea that you should that if you're hungry, you have to go to a government official and that
Why do you have to do that? I mean, if it is an obligation of all human beings, if it is the obligation of people watching Kitty Genovese being murdered to come and help, why do you say that to recognize that would be an invitation to go to the government to ask these people to come out of their 13th floor in the Queen's building in order to help? Why the government coming in here?
Kitty Genovese did not starve to death.
No,
the people in Gujarat, the problem with the Muslims in Gujarat wasn't that they were hungry; it was that they were murdered. And we have no disagreement about the right to life.
What we are asking, why do you say the government? Actually, why is it? You know, we have all have involvements. When an economist works on economic problem, as you do, you're trying to bring about a different kind of world. More orderly world in which maybe less people would be hungry too. Some people directly work on that. Institutions like from Oxfam to CARE to others, NGOs work for that, UN works for that, the government, yes indeed, among many other institutions. And the media makes facts known. There's an obligation to bring that about. If a media says, look, I don't really care whether people are not very interested, they're interested in game results, which is often the case. That to say, therefore, I don't have to do it. To say that, look, you're failing in your obligation to draw attention of people to this, I think is important. I think one of the things that the tsunami things brought out is that when the suffering of people can be easily perceived, which is in the case of tsunami, they just washed away, then the amount of sympathy that comes is dramatic. And yet, when hungry people are dying from hunger or hunger-related diseases, somewhere, tucked away, and there's nothing you read about the paper, there's no way for you to perceive that. I mean, people who would be normally caring don't feel moved to do anything. So that's why it seems to me what is one of the great positive things of public reasoning, as John Rawls would quote it, forgive me, a philosopher, but okay to read, that to not see that its major public impact in a positive direction seems to me to be somewhat difficult to explain.
Okay, I'm going to open up the floor for some questions. There are microphones here, 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 and here, so you should get up in line.
And people could announce who they are.
And the ground rules here are very simple. First, I'd like to announce who you are. Second of all, we are opening up for questions. Good questions have several characteristics. One is they are short, and the second is they end with a question mark. And so I will tend to enforce that with some rigor. Let me start. I will just go here and around the horn here. So right here in the front.
Stephen Marks, I direct the FXB Center that Jackie referred to, and we are directing this project on poverty and human rights. But I was taken aback by the rule, so the comments that I wanted to make I'll have to reserve to another occasion and make one of the comments and add a question mark through inflection at the end, I guess. Let me squeeze in two if you'll allow me.
Please, sure.
First one is that when you referred to the right to health as one of your examples of saying it doesn't do any good to consider this a natural right, were you not contradicting your own starting point of your four uses of rights when you said it's a right over which there is some agreement? Now, on the right to health, there is agreement internationally. There's only one country in the world does not recognize that the right to health is an internationally recognized human right. Got nothing to do with accepting it as a natural right. So are you not contradicting yourself there? And I would like to move in my extending this question to the issue of the debate that I don't think has been adequately addressed even by Amartya, which is, what has this got to do with the overall phenomenon of poverty, the importance of which you certainly recognize in economic terms? But what would be the value of introducing a human rights framework into strategies to deal with poverty reduction? What would be the difference independently of the other concerns that you mentioned that are subsets of that? And there is an answer to that that is being addressed by various agencies, but I'd like to know what your view is on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff?
I don't see that I'm contradicting myself. I see a right as an institution, not necessarily a law, where we agree that that people have, and you can propose it and fight for it, and then maybe you can get it. Other countries have written down the right to health care, and the U.S. Pretty much has not. It is interesting that the standard of health care in the U.S. is one of the highest in the world. We got a lot of problems with the system, but in fact, it's one of the highest in the world. I don't see the contradiction. It's costs and benefits. Some things are definitely worth writing down as a right. Other things I think clearly are not, and there's some things that are a little more at the margin.
Can I comment on it?
Absolutely.
I think the U.S. Standard of healthcare is fantastic. I see my doctor sitting here now. Absolutely perfect, no question. And I follow his instruction. I even move from a high chair to a low chair in a kind that he would approve of in the present context. No, I think if there's a medical problem, I would think of being treated in the United States rather than anywhere else. But that's quite different from the issue of the reach of the healthcare. This is the country which has the best healthcare, and it also has some of the worst healthcare. That's where the problem is. I mean, one of the early works I did some years ago, and I think it's still probably true, that the probability of reaching a high age on the part of African American urban residents in this country is lower than that in China or India or Sri Lanka and many other countries which are much, much poorer. Why should it happen in the country with the best medical care in the world? That's the question that seems to me, Jeff, you have to address. And is it the case that not recognizing health, which is what Stephen was pressing you on, has something to do with it? That's one question, and that adds to that. The Stephen's other question, which is addressed to me, what about poverty? You know, I think as long as we keep thinking of poverty as just low income, I don't think, first of all, you mislead it, because people are not just concerned with low income because, you know, they want to lead a life. And you want to see, are you hungry, are you unsheltered, are you unclothed, are you dying of illness, and so forth. And premature mortality, avoidable morbidity, these are characteristics of poverty. And these relate to the various rights that we've been talking about. And it's true both in terms of describing poverty as well as human sympathy. If you go around saying, you know, people have so many, I find these dreadful numbers, so many people have less than $2 a day of income. You know, for people to understand, I don't know the prices, what kind of commodities they buy, rather than saying that dying of illnesses of which we know the cure, and at a price of 5 cents we can produce that drug, and that's not being produced. I mean, that is a real serious poverty analysis. So what I'm really claiming is that understanding of poverty, as well as intelligent and humane response to poverty relates to just the kind of issue that it seems to me Jeff is trying to deny, namely our obligation to think about deprivations of people in terms of being hungry, being ill, needlessly ill, unclothed and unsheltered, and so on.
I wonder if in your response here, Marcia, there was a hint of some overlapping agreement here. I mean, the right to medical care is actually very interesting. It's one I care deeply about. I've spent much of my life studying poverty, and medical care is really critical. But as soon as you say the right to medical care, as opposed to health, which is even harder, by the way, since so many things determine health far beyond medical care, what level? Does everyone have the right to the level of medical care that you're getting right now with your remarkable doctor who gives you great support? The kind of medical care that I can get at this great university and with all its resources? Because if the answer is unlimited, then it will crowd out many things that are actually more important for health, like housing and education and other kinds of things. So the level, one of the difficulties I struggle with the rights language in economic settings where there isn't a clear you're there and you're not. And you said this a lot in your poverty example. You were saying it's not just $2 a day, come on. And much of your writing is poverty is a very rich sense of connection.
No, I agree. And it's not, but it's not replacing 2 by 5. That's not either.
No, that's right. And
yeah.
so.
But it seems to me that I think the whole claim to rights, and there I do agree with Jeff, that agreement has something to do with it. It's not manifest agreement, but the claim that if people were not put in prison for expressing their point of view, if the media were free, some kind of an understanding that these will come to be accepted. And actually the biggest proof that this might be the case is what happens in tyrannical regimes. They're so terrified of these things being expressed, they put them instantly in prison. Now, what such agreement would emerge in the context of a country would really depend on what the conditions of that country happen to be. So, and this is a point that was made very clearly in more than 200 years ago, Mary Wollstonecraft in a book on Vindication of the Rights of Woman. That is, when you have to think about these rights, there are some rights that there's no reason why they should be violated now. But as things proceed, the whole question, right, to a higher education on the part of all women as well as men, which in 1791 would have looked very remote, is not something that you press for, but that doesn't mean that you forget it. It's just that if you're doing an analysis as to what can be done and what it would be most sensible to press for now, that's a substantive debate, not a debate about language. It's a debate about actual policy, what we should do. And I'm very glad that you brought that up, because it's that contingency of rights of the circumstances which is important. And maybe, if I may say that, maybe Jeff's fear is that there will not be that contingency if people really took the language of right, as he puts it, seriously. I wanted to assure you that's not the case.
A quick response.
Yeah, quickly. The figure that almost 3 billion people live in poverty below $2 a day is an attempt to measure what the poor actually buy, what their consumer basket is. Now, some things like clean air and water probably isn't in there. Lifespan probably isn't in there. And Amartya Sen has done very useful work arguing that a measure of human development should include these other things. But they do tend to be pretty highly correlated. David, you said about what level. Healthcare is a good example, because if you ask me what my position is, yeah, I think that we should codify this to some extent in the United States. But sometimes people use the language, every American should be entitled to the best possible health care. Well, that is meaningless, and it would be harmful if that language were adopted. It would be an obstacle to achieving it.
It's really meaningless. It couldn't do much harm, could it? Because it wouldn't communicate anything.
It would tie things.
What you're really saying that is not meaningless, you're saying it's meaningful, but in your judgment,
you'd be
false.
spending money on litigation rather than health care, so it would be harmful.
Well, it's a question, but you're saying something more than that.
So I should go to the next question up here.
Hi, my name is Victoria Salinas, and I'm a second year at the Kennedy School, and my question's for Professor Sen. The president of Sierra Leone has declared that by 2007, nobody in the country will go to bed hungry. This is a country where food security is a very big problem, and a country that's also recently emerged from war. One of the causes of the war was people feeling that government didn't deliver on promises, didn't take care of the people in an adequate way. So my question is, if trying to enforce rights and promote them could lead to conflict or renewed violence, is it an efficient and practical way to go?
Well, I think there are two things to say. First of all, the trying to get people to a situation when no one goes to bed hungry, I don't see why it should tend to have any kind of positive effect on conflict. If anything, it's likely to have the opposite. On the other hand, I can't really comment on the Sierra Leone situation. I haven't, it's not something I'm familiar with. And I think you probably know all economists follow a rule, never to comment on a country over which you have not flown in broad daylight at least once. So I haven't done that to Sierra Leone.
Oh, too true. Yes, up here.
When you let the language of rights proliferate, how do you ensure it's not used dangerously? As when, there was a point in American history when the right to property was viewed as fundamental, as the right to basic health care or to good health, and property meant slaves.
I don't know what exactly the concern you are. That is, if you think that the claims are being put up in a way that would be absurd, like everyone has a right to the best health care in the world. My favorite is to say everyone has a right to have an income higher than the national average, which is, I think then our duty is to say that that's really not a very sensible right to ask for. But that's a debate about rights. It's not a good right to ask for. We are criticizing it rather than saying, forget it. Now talk, play some music, but talk about something else. You want to say, look, that's not a right way of thinking about it. But that requires you to raise that question, to think about it, to say, that's not a very good way of doing it. So it's what we have difficulty with is the idea that in order to leave out erroneous or silly statements, you want to stop conversation altogether on that subject. I don't see why that we want to do that. On the contrary, we want conversation to say that wasn't a very well put, very well argued case.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Jiang Chen in Graduate School of Arts and Science. My question is to Sen, Dr. Sen. So is it possible that the discussion of language of rights bring in a rigidity into the discussion? Rigidity into the discussion. Because once you bring up, you state something as a right, people associate with a certain non-negotiability. And instead of talking about right to clean air, why not talk about the policy priority of environmental protection instead of talking about right to quality education? Why not talking about the specific policy of prioritizing education in poor area? So what does the discussion of right bring in a sense of non-negotiability into the discussion?
No, you are bringing in non-negotiability. I didn't. That is, there are three things here. First of all, to say that a right is recognized is not to say that it's not negotiable. That would be only the case where feasibility is regarded as an essential condition of recognizing a right. Rather than discussing how could feasibility be expanded to institutional change, like bringing in democracy, which would be an institutional change. It's not feasible now. If you're supposing you're discussing in a country where it's not democratic, even in Iraq, saying a person does not have the right to be secure from terrorist attack. Now, to say, no, you can't bring that about, is certainly right. But to say that, look, this is an important right and we should work towards making that possible, that's what the right discussion is contributing. And if democracy is a way of bringing that about, if public reasoning along with votes would have been even a better way of bringing it about, then that's the direction that we might wish to go. So that's the first issue. And so the second issue is that when you are dealing with a situation of this kind, And we know that it's not just economic social rights, but right not to be attacked, right not to be humiliated or any such thing, which we may regard to be important, will not be fully realizable. The question of what the priorities are. So any kind of right-based public discussion has to take into account the relative importance of rights that you should take note of. And this is absolutely essential. It's only in the context of if you would take rights to be nothing other than legal rights, then of course, it is the case that you shouldn't have contradictory legal rights. It's not the case that there isn't examples of that, but there are. But by and large, that the legal rights tend to be consistent. But when you're dealing with the domain of human rights, you're trying to move the world in a certain direction. That is certainly not a situation in which the idea of non-negotiability can have a rightful place. The third point is that insofar as you're encouraging public discussion, that's one of the reasons why I think rights are important. To say it's a policy priority, okay, that's a policy priority of the government. It does not include what the duties of others are. The government may fail in their policy priority. If I take the view, I don't know about Sierra Leone, but somewhere where hunger could be easily prevented, take my own country, at the time when India became independent in 1947, we've just emerged 3 years earlier from a famine. Now, the government supposedly did do nothing to stop famines. You could say it's a policy failure. But then if the citizens don't speak up, it's a failure of some kind. And what is it a failure of? It's a failure of our general imperfect obligation, as Kant would put it, and if you don't want to use such big words, our general sense of duty to demand that appropriate policies be followed such that people don't unnecessarily die. That is not captured by policy priority. That is, which is entirely a matter of internal government logic, but it is captured by having the dialogue of human rights, emphasizing the importance on it, and focusing on what we have to do in addition to what the government is doing, including if the government is dependent on us, which is, after all, the main reason for democracy, where we have a particularly strong obligation.
Jeff, do you want to comment? Or? Next question here.
I'm Isaias Chavez. I'm a freshman at the college. My question is for Professor Frankel. It seems to me that your argument against using rights as a framework for thinking about poverty, about alleviating poverty, is basically a utilitarian one. You seem to think that by instituting that sort of either language or mode of thought, we wouldn't get as much societal good from it, right? But my question is whether utilitarianism is the right way to be thinking about these issues at all, because it seems to me that when one phrases those questions about those urgent issues in terms of utilitarianism, there's always a possibility of having them deferred or of just shuffling them around in certain ways which can be very morally impalatable. I'm sure that one could conceive of an argument that would justify torture in certain cases if there's certain utilitarian value for it, right? But for some reason, we don't allow utilitarianism ever to creep into that discussion. So then, do you think that utilitarianism is the right framework at all?
Yeah, I mean, I plead guilty. I confess, I am a utilitarian. Which doesn't mean I agree with everything Jeremy Bentham wrote.
He did write, by the way. You agree with one thing, because he did talk about human rights in the context of the French Declaration of Human Rights. He described it as not only nonsense, but as nonsense on stilts, which I take it to be some kind of an artificially elevated nonsense. That's not very far from your position on this respect. I think the interesting thing there, of course, is that he just gives the argument and moves away.
I mean, if I might agree with it, that description, if it's saying that that everyone has a natural God-given right to a standard of living or whatever. Where I agree with you and not Bentham is if Bentham is saying that there exists no idea of rights other than what's in the law or should be in the law. Because I agree, there's other institutions that are not in the law. So
no, I think you're right.
I think on that one think on that one we...
I can see it breaks your heart to agree with me, but I think you're probably true.
Not at all. Although it does actually break my heart to disagree with Jeremy Bentham, I have to say. But
What a world.
but wait a minute, there was something else. Yeah, you say that if you don't use the language of rights, there's a danger that it will be deferred and you won't get it. Well, if you do use the language of rights, there's a danger it will be deferred. And just on the torture thing, by the way, I mean, I think torture is, of all the ones, is the clearest one, is really sort of the clearest one, that yes, just say, that torture doesn't matter what would be accomplished. I think we should have it written down. We do have it written down that you don't weigh pros and cons or whatever. I'm in favor of that. Having said that, I actually have some doubts, and here's my problem. Why isn't the American public more outraged about Abu Ghraib and these other, and Guantanamo, et cetera? I think it's because 53% of the American public have this image of the ticking time bomb and the terrorist who is going to blow up airplanes or the World Trade Center, and they actually think that if torture would prevent that, it would be worth it. And, the philosophers can debate it. But look, here's the thing. None of those guys in Abu Ghraib, none of those guys in Guantanamo are in that category. All these people we tortured, I mean, there's probably a few of them who are guilty of something, but why, if you can get everybody together, if you can use the cost-benefit analysis and get all the people who are opposed to torture under all circumstances, together with the people who say, this is really dumb, this kind of torture that we're doing is hurting us all throughout the world, and it's going to hurt our long-run goals, yeah, I'll take the utilitarian argument together with the other one, because it would get a majority on the right side.
Right up here.
My question is whether the difference between saying that there is a right and a policy priority has to do with the evaluation of the moral agent. So, for example, if we say that there is a right to basic medical care, basic as opposed to advanced medical care, that if we don't respect that right, then the person who doesn't respect that right is evil or doing something that's wrong, or he's immoral. Whereas if he does perform that right, he's just simply meeting his basic obligations. But if we say that there's a policy priority and we fail to perform that policy priority, the moral agent is simply not doing something that is desirable, but he's not doing something that's evil. Whereas if he does perform that policy priority, he is doing something that's desirable, but it's simply an act of what philosophers call supererogation. It's something that he's not required to perform or has a duty to perform. I wonder if that difference captures the difference between your two positions.
I think in a country that writes down some aspiration, like freedom from hunger, I think if you do try to figure out what government bureaucrats are failing, I don't think people think they're evil. I don't think it adds to the moral pressure against them. I think they understand why it's unrealistic, and that they think in terms of the pros and cons in much more practical ways, what could increase economic welfare.
Yeah, well, I think there's something of substance there, namely that it's the role of the human beings in society, including citizens in the national context, but the human beings generally in the global context, the moral, what is it that you owe morally to others, is a central issue, and that's not the same thing as a policy priority. If that's the distinction, yes, I agree with that. We could have discussed it more, but I can see that the chair is looking at his watch with increasing frequency. So.
You're a wise man. We have time for one more question. You've been standing quite a long time, so let me give you the chance for the last question.
All right, though I'm going to struggle like Stephen Marx to turn it into a question rather than a comment.
Very important.
I'll
Short
work it.
question.
I'm Maria Green. I teach human rights and development at Brandeis University. And let me try, I'm coming from the law side, so I'm going to be relatively narrow. If we define rights as something that inherently has an obligation, if we accept that definition of right, that when we say something is a right, we are defining someone else as having an obligation. When we make something like when we make something like access to the highest attainable standard of health or freedom from hunger a right, all we are doing by definition is stating that someone has an obligation. In the international human rights law, we're saying government has a series of obligations. My question is, how is that harmful? In other words, in what circumstance, simply by stating who has the obligation, are you causing harm? My next question is, is it not possible that in the situation of hunger, extreme hunger, very often it's possible to see what's going on simply as a matter of accident? And is it not possible that reframing it as right forces an analysis of who is causing the hunger through certain policies, or whose policies could be in play to prevent the hunger?
That's
all right.
Good enough. Thank you. Jeff, I'll let you start here.
How is it harmful? I mean, I've given examples. Wasting money in litigation is one. Another is if it diverts attention from the ways that, by emphasizing the legal process, it diverts, and the political process diverts attention from the ways that the objective could be delivered. Another is it makes, if it's something that's not going to be enforced, even approximately, it loses legitimacy, and it undermines the legitimacy of those rights and laws that that can be enforced. People lose respect for their word right.
Yeah, well, I don't think we have enough time to engage on that. My position is not different from her, but I don't know how much it is possible, of course, that if you, say, to have the moon is everybody's right, that you may really move the discussion onto an utterly unhelpful arena. But the way to address it, of course, would be to deny that. So it's not so much that all assertions of right are fine, but the idea that a wrong assertion of right, a silly assertion of right, has to be dealt with by abolishing the concept itself, rather than saying that wasn't a very good way of thinking about right. That's where I think our disagreement lies. It's not the case that you cannot tie yourself in complete knots. There's no such thing as a foolproof system, because no system can resist a proper fool.
All right. I thank you all very much for your participation. Professor Sen, I really am enormously grateful for your time and your wisdom. And Jeff, also I'm grateful for both of those, plus your courage in going against a Nobel Prize winner. So thank you all very much.